Good day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today, I would like to address the concept of just law. There is a concept that I have been contemplating while I was rereading the letter from the Birmingham jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and in that he is speaking to some fellow religious leaders who are asking Martin Luther to calm down and to recognize that his pushback against injustice is going to trigger potential violence, and they want to just keep the peace. And King is saying to them in his lettered reply that, well, that just doesn't make sense, because peace isn't the absence of pushback. That if there is an unjust law, it is a right and a duty and an obligation of members of a civil society to not submit to that law willingly. And that peaceful protest and peaceful dissent does not mean that the other side is going to readily comply without stirring up trouble. Rather, that in knowing the depths of the capacity that the other side could go to as they try to wrangle back the power that they feel is being taken from them, this very oppressive power, that they are likely to retaliate in violent ways. Because it's not a far extension going from a violent and oppressive law that does violence against the personal dominion of an individual, against their personhood, or as Dr. King references it as a individual's personality. These oppressive laws are not just and they are not fair, and it is a sort of violence against those people, but it is a one-sided violence. It is something that only goes to harm the individual that it's directed towards, and then empower the individual who is put in the position of being allowed to be an oppressor based off of this pivot point by which the law applied gives them the right to do something that is against what would be considered a moral law. And the moral law would be that thou shalt not harm another, especially not for personal gains or for, joy's sake. Like, we should never create the conditions by which people could profit from human suffering, or to find a sense of thrill or enjoyment knowing that you can harm certain people and do things that you couldn't do against other certain types of people because it would be against the law. But you can do those things against these particular people because of this arbitrary scheme that we've created that justifies based off of these, segregational, categorical, keeping of the categories. These people can be isolated from the law in the reasonable moral sense to be conflicting. And the problem with that, of course, is not just the moral sense that where King is trying to explain to these faith leaders that, it's wrong to harm anybody. It goes against the moral laws that we are trying to preach and teach. But it's also the underlining principle of the hypocrisy nullifies the legitimacy. And what that's basically saying is, in this letter, he's saying that an unjust law is a code that a majority inflicts onto a minority that is not binding on itself. This is difference made legal. And so the code saying that the white people were able to inflict a certain type of strangulation of the rights, suppression of the rights, limitation of the rights, confinement of the person, individual who is a minority, in such a way that that exact same law could not be bound on the majority itself, because of the oppressive element existing within the law that says, Black people need only apply, this need only apply to Black people, is itself contradictory, hypocritical, cynical, and morally wrong. Especially if, as King referenced in so many words, if we are, all God's people, and not even having to go into the religious aspect, we are all the same, human family. And there's nothing that can separate the fact that we are all humans. And to try to segregate and separate that is to try to reject parts of ourselves. And the big part about that is, of course, if you reject part of yourself, you're refusing to understand that part of yourself. And therefore you are condemning your own self to a stubborn ignorance and a refusal to grasp the bigger picture, fully contend with all the variables that must be taken into account. And you are forcibly blinding yourself to the realities of things as they are. By rejecting a portion of our humanness, though it may take a varied and different form, that can, be categorized and then segregated, is to reject a part of your own self. And in that, you are rejecting your own truth, which means that you will remain ignorant of who you truly are. And that is a great oppressor to the progress of humanity, because it's trying to say that, the white people had all of the power amassed and they didn't want things to change, because why would you want things to change when you could do all kinds of harmful and dreadful and god-awful and cruel and inhumane things, but under the name of the law it was all right, even though the moral law, the higher law, the universal law says no, that's not okay. And so a human-made law tried to suggest that it was superior enough to justify doing all these things that went directly against what many of these people, including the faith leaders that were addressing in criticism, Dr. King, were saying that, we're teaching the moral laws to everybody. We're teaching people how to walk upright in this world. We're teaching people how to follow in the path and the footsteps and the good role model influence of Christ. But it's okay that these other people aren't abiding by that, because man-made law says it's, okay for them to do these things that would not be able to stand up against scrutiny if compared and contrast to the moral legitimacies that which their faith had bound them to not only preach and teach, but also to emulate and to model and to influence and to encourage and to inspire in other people and aspire to themselves. And so there's no binding aspects to it. The only binding element of it is the very fact of the oppression. It's the sense that you must submit to this law because there was some ruling authority that says that it's okay to do this. And when held up to the foil against the higher laws, just as our founding fathers of the United States said that we as a nation are submit only to the higher law, the universal law, the law of God and nature's God, that below that is our nation standing. So we are a nation under a God indivisible, meaning that we can't be divided because we're all united by that same concept that we are below that higher law. But then human laws made in for segregation, these unjust laws deviate so widely and broadly and discriminatively against what that moral law compels us to do, teaches us to do. And so Dr. King goes on to say that a just law is a code that a majority compels the minority to follow, that it itself is willing to follow, that it's willingly to follow itself. This is the sameness made legal, or as I like to look at it, equality. Equal justice under the law. It's not hypocritical. It is not contradictory. It is not forcible, compulsory compliance. It is saying that we recognize by the natural order of the universe that we need to be able to organize ourselves and give ourselves a delineation and a definition of the bounds and the limitations of what's right and what's wrong, and put it in tangible words, because we understand that in our becoming process as people, everybody has a different starting point in terms of their personal revelation of the understanding of the difference between right and wrong in the moral universe that we live in. We have to go through life experiences in order to fully integrate that to the point where you can speak from a place of understanding and then see the world through a lens of understanding so that you can be in compliance with it in the most natural sense, where it would kick in your own head and you're like, self-governance tells me that this is the right thing to do and this is the wrong thing to do. And then you abide by what is just, fair, reasonable, and right in that moment. So you're doing the right thing at the right time in the right way for the right reasons. But our morality in the moral universe that we live in is established off of moral legitimacies that we retain from the environments that we are raised in, the environments we work in, the environments that we have human experiences and human encounters in. All of these things help to define, delineate, and distinguish the moral universe that we live in. And it gives us these testings of our sensibilities, our reasonableness, our identities and our personalities and our character. And then it pushes us and pulls us, and it gives a little bit of that conflicting tension, as Dr. King had referenced it in this letter, this conflicting tension that is created. And it reminds me of one of my great books. I believe it's called I can't remember the name exactly, but it's an organizational book talking about organization. And one of the things it's talking about creativity is the existence of contrary elements that are in opposition with one another. And that it is through imagining these 2 points having kind of like a mechanization with a band going between them. And these 2 contrary points are rotating and they are moving that band against one another. And just like in a driving belt in a vehicle, it is the appropriate amount of tension, but enough of the looseness and then the pliability of the actual, band itself, and the rotation of these conflicting forces, and then the belt actually moving along because it's carried through on this thing. That's the functionality of the point of contention between these two opposing forces. And the movement that's happening between that, where you yourself are going between this is right, this is wrong. And so how do I best operate in this moment so that I can just keep moving in progress, you know? If the universe says anything, there is one rule, and it is progress. And what is progress but evolution? What is evolution but the communication of what next must be done? You know, and in the situational context, the historical context, the fine context, what must now be done? And that's the contention that we have in this moment between these opposing forces. And we are trying to stay in alignment to say, you know, individually, we can't completely overcome this negative force. We can't eradicate it. We can't make it disappear because it exists as a potentialitude in the universe. But there is also this positive element that exists that we know is morally right. And if we could, we would be completely upright with that. That's what we would want. But we can't always be that way because there's this opposing force that exists. And that tension between it is the creative element that gives us what we would call free will to act upon in that moment. So in this reference where Dr. King is explaining that there's the difference between an unjust law and a just law, and they are rotating on the same axis with one another, and independently rotating on their own axis, and they are creating this contention of forces pulling you and trying to get you to go the right way, but at the same time recognize that, well, what is right? And you only know what is right by understanding what it is not. By knowing what it's not, you understand what it is. It gives you a better way to create the context of something. It's like a dusting on the surface of something that reveals what is there that is invisible, but you can only see it by these elements that are able to lay across it and reveal that there is form there is structure, there is something there of substance. And it has significance to it as you begin to understand what it is in contrast to what it's not. And so this, you know, contention between these two different elements of a just law and an unjust law comes the individual citizen that says to themselves, I want to be a law-abiding citizen because in the teachings of my moral uprightness, you know, I was raised to be a good person, to follow the law and to respect authority and to submit myself to the laws of the land because that's part of the civic responsibility and duty. But there is another part to this, guys, because what I'm seeing as being implemented as law, what they're saying is just, fair, reasonable, and right, when brought to the foil against my moral understanding of the teachings of my Lord, I understand that doesn't actually add up in equivalencies. You know, I am taught to love my neighbor. I am taught that everyone is a part of God's children, and there is no justification for these harms, and that you must rise up against the oppressor who would take away your sensibilities of being able to make the free will decision between right and wrong on your own, so that you can build your character as a conscious moral person, and then, you know, bring that form out into the world and represent it in a model that other people can willingly follow as well. And that's how we formulate the raising of our society into good, just, upright, moral individuals that are self-governed, which the more self-governed you are in the sensibilities of mutualities, mutualism, mutual respect, mutual interest, mutual benefits, mutual securities, you don't have to worry about, there's no need for not to say that there's no need for laws to be written, but there's no requirements for it to be enforced. Laws, in order to be written, must be enforceable. But the point of the exercise is to create laws that only help us give a model representation of the ideal of this is what is wrong, so that we have the reference to say, I know what is right, and I'm going to live by what is right in accordance to, these social and civic ideals of domestic order and law-abiding citizenship. And the whole point is for us to be able to cultivate that inside of ourselves so we can self-govern without needing to have some outside authority to enforce upon us the right thing to do at the time. And society is supposed to raise ourselves in such a way where we just abide by the laws that are just, fair, reasonable, and right, so that we don't have to have a mass amount of, concentrated power and an authority that could keep the checks and balances so that people do the right thing at the right time. And we're supposed to cultivate the sensibility so families can raise good, healthy, morally upright individuals. And that in our schools and our classrooms, we're supposed to teach people how to best example a good person, and to understand where we've been as a society, that we have been really bad before, guys. We've done some terrible things in our past, but we overcame those things when we realized that we had the power within ourselves to make those sorts of changes. And that though the struggle would be hard, it would be necessary. And the point is to win over the hearts and minds of the individuals who are doing the things that are, as we now see in our moral growth and development, wrong things, and that they need to be corrected and brought back into the moral legitimacies of, the human family. And we've evolved over time, but that historical reference gives us a point to say, we know where we've been and where we're not going back to. But in our becoming process, we're grateful that we have that lesson that we have learned, because it gives us the, example that doesn't have to exist in modern times in order for us to have the deep reflection to keep us morally upright. We don't have to create the, negative polarity in order for us to be able to align ourselves with the positive one. And so in Dr. King's, letter, bringing it down to the simple concept of a law, in order for it to be binding and legitimate and just, it must apply equally to all under which that law has jurisdiction. In the United States of America, we have federal law in which everyone here lies within the jurisdiction of. And we have, or anybody who does business here, and then we have state laws in which everybody in that state lies within the jurisdiction of. And local laws, everybody lies within the jurisdiction of. And then within our own individual communities, there's a, not necessarily written, but a general consensus understanding of, how to have, respect for your neighborhood. And we fall under the jurisdiction of that. And then ultimately the individual home is its own jurisdiction, which falls under the, rules and that govern that home. And so at all of these various levels, we have these jurisdictions to which we willingly submit to because of the great protections that those instituted governing elements provide for us. You follow the rules of your home because in this home, it provides you sanctuary and it provides you safety and the provisions of life vitality in the form of resources. It provides you comforts, and it provides you communion, and it provides you with safe space for development and a way to sanctuary yourself from the rest of the world, and then teach you that when you leave that space, you have, these core home-made values of what it takes to be an upright individual when you are in relation with other people. And then when you step out of those doors of your sanctuary, of your home, on top of the rules that are applied in your home space jurisdiction, you are now within the jurisdiction of your neighborhood, you're in the jurisdiction of your locality, you're in the jurisdiction of your state, you're in the jurisdiction of the federal, and in every one of those jurisdictions there are laws and rules that define and delineate what is expected of an upright citizen to conduct themselves under. And there's so many varied laws, it's difficult to understand them all. That's why it's just the core basis of, just how to be a good person. And to teach that sensibility of what's right and what's wrong should be enough to prevent you from being an offender of some, designated law that you may not know is on the books. But it should be sensible and reasonable that you just do the right thing by just being a good person, uncompromisingly. But unfortunately, especially in the times of, the civil rights fight, there were many laws that exist on the books, arbitrary laws that were schemed to be able to capture, opportunity for authority to enforce upon certain minorities, a type of subjugation to an oppressive ideology that empowers the individual that's there in the moment, that has been handed the, just, capacity to cause harm without having consequences for those harmful actions, or law enforcement that is able to enforce an extreme prejudice against these certain people simply based off of the color of their skin, an easy identifiable marker by which it gives a free pass card to anybody doing anything wrong to that individual, based off of the fact that law does not uphold for that individual in the same way that it upholds for somebody who is not of that particular race. That law cannot be just because it cannot be binding on everybody equally. Not having equal justice under the law is a difference law, and difference cannot be made legal, in the sense of saying that the law applies to thee, but not to me. And in order to be a just law, as Dr. King said, is that it has to be a law that's compelling, which again goes back to the ultimate element, the ultimate power of law is self-governance. You want to be able to have a law that people just willingly follow, so you don't have to have enforcement. The law has to be enforceable if need be, but the most powerful law is the one that has already been, socially and civically inculcated and educated into society within the jurisdiction of the home, and the cultivating environments there that help to teach and raise people to be upright, and the schools that help to teach and to help to form model, law-abiding citizens that themselves put themselves in check. Like, I know that that's not right. I know that's not just, that's not fair, that's not reasonable. And then to have, law enforcement that knows there are going to be times when things get out of hand, and that there needs to be a moderating influence at that time to intervene on behalf of the individual, or intercede on their behalf in cases that are preventative measures, preventing things from getting out of hand at some point. So we're here to protect and serve, is what law enforcement is supposed to be about. Their public safety. They're supposed to be community members that are there to help, just to show of presence, that everybody knows that things are going to be okay. Because if for some reason in a heated moment of decisions left to their own devices, somebody did not have the moral legitimacies, the ethical bounds, or the upright integrities instilled within them through life experience to know what to do that is right at that time. and they fall out of alignment with what would be considered just under the interpretations of the law, and therefore the moderating influence intercedes on behalf of the individual to prevent further harm and to initiate the mechanizations of the justice system to provide a corrective mechanism in that moment to set that individual who is not abiding by the law into the corrective mechanism so that they can start becoming corrective to that law, and to learn the vital lesson and to be held to account, so that to make sure that they are fully understanding what they did wrong and what they could have done that would have been right, and what they must now do to set it right, and then to return back into the makings and the alignment of a upright citizen, law-abiding citizen. And the problem is we don't have a justice system that's about corrective measures. It's about, correction facilities are about punitive punishment, isolation, and they're not about how can we restore these people back in to, the uprightness of civil society. And so in the times of, segregation, which, allowed essentially for people to get away with murder, allowed people to abuse and exploit and extort and harm and to do violence against certain individuals who the law didn't apply to in a protective capacity, but rather protected the oppressor. As Dr. King explained in this, it's like, the law is meant to protect the person who is being robbed, not protect the robber. And that is the difference between a just law and an unjust law. And in order for society to be democratically structured, it has to allow for all people to decide whether or not, that is a law that they themselves could submit to. It's the same concept of, why we have a by, for, and of government of the people is because the people themselves are supposed to decide and say, okay, given my upbringing, given my understanding through life experience, and given my, considerations of what is just, fair, reasonable, right, from my learned experience and my education and my first education for, my upbringing in my home, to me, it seems like the law should be created so that we have the definition and delineation of what not to do, that says this particular thing is not, it would be offensive to the moral legitimacies of a just, fair, reasonable, right society, where all people are equal and that they're endowed by their creator with life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It would actually go against that, such a law. So it can't be legitimized and formalized into some code. And or that we recognize that people have a tendency to do things in such a way that harms person or property, and if left to their own devices, because unfortunately society has not caught up yet with educating the moral legitimacies of right and wrong in these conditions, or that there are enough models out there that when left to their own devices, people have been given a sense that I could get away with that. So we need to define, delineate, and distinguish what is wrong, what is against the law, which is, the moral, law of the universe, what's right, and distinguish that and put that to a code which has a specific type of language that says we can define and delineate what is wrong given these terms and conditions and perspectives, the way to look at it. And within that, we can suggest an appropriate set of standards by which corrective measures can be taken to reassert somebody, because maybe somebody broke the law unwittingly. Sometimes maybe people were persuaded by, desperations, or they were, led to believe that it was okay, even though it wasn't, because they just didn't have a clear understanding of the law. Or maybe they were compelled by force or intimidation or threat of harm or life. And maybe they were led to believe they had no other choice. And then maybe there were people that just maliciously, decided to be a bad actor with nefarious intent and to do the thing they knew they shouldn't have done, because who was going to stop them? And it was worth it to them for the risk to, that they might not get caught. And so they were going to do it anyway. There's differences in terms of the intent behind it. And law is supposed to, define those things and then understand, where is that person coming from? And this is why we have to have court cases, because we have to understand maybe that person didn't know what they were doing, And so you have a case brought to court to say, okay, well, these are all the things. And now, based off of understanding that, what would be the appropriate course of correction? Obviously, you're not going to enforce the same type of corrective mechanism on somebody who unwittingly did something as you would for somebody who wittingly did it, And so you have to understand the details of the situation in order to apply the right corrective mechanism. Otherwise, those who are applying the law in such a way where it does not take into consideration all those factors, which are the things that make the law itself legitimate, then it's going beyond the law itself, which a great example is what's happening right now in the, extrajudicial killings that are happening by order of the President of the United States to, indiscriminately bomb certain types of boats in certain areas of international waters off of the presumption that these could potentially be, if left unchecked, amount to eventually potentially causing a significant amount of harm, though not truly fully quantifiable, that would afflict the American people in a detrimental way. And so by those justifications would then therefore give legitimacies to take a preemptive strike to prevent those things from happening. The problem being, of course, that there is no details on the merits to say this is what we understand to be the facts of the matter. This is how we came to those conclusions, and why we think within reasonable cause that the only option that we have available to us in order to preempt the potential harm that could come in the future to American people, we're left with no other path of recourse unless we intervene and intercede at this moment in time, in this way, in this context, at this intensity, understanding that all of the variables have to exist in order for us to be justified in that, including us submitting to the fact that, America isn't the ruler of the world. There are other law-abiding, jurisdictions that we must fall into, especially in international waters. And unfortunately, none of the necessary things that would formalize the legitimacies for us to be able to, stand on the merits as being justified for those actions exist. There's no legitimacy that exists. There's no legitimacy that has been offered. It has been left to say, the president has been led to believe, because it's not like he's going out there and inspecting this himself. He's been fed content and context and reference and strategical, operations that you could choose from. These are the different ways we can approach this. And out of all that information he's been fed, he's came to the conclusion, either by, personal consideration of all the elements at play, or by just simply trusting in whoever's telling him these things, that the right course of action was to just deploy bombs to bomb these people without due process, without arresting them, without questioning them, they may have information that could lead towards, the bigger problem in that issue isn't the person trying to, take and transport, potentially transport, illicit drugs that could maybe one day possibly somehow find its way into the United States and could maybe possibly cause harm to, some portion of the population. Instead of finding out from those distributors the source of, well, where's it coming from, and then meeting that much larger threat with some sort of corrective course of action, is not doing anything other than maybe signaling to them that, doesn't matter what you make, you're not going to be able to get it out because we're going to keep bombing you. And in that sense, the intimidation factor is not going to work forever if you continuously choose to not abide by laws, because you yourself are proving you are not morally legitimate, and therefore your authority is not based off of integrity. And there is a point by which that will start to fall apart, because things without integrity eventually do start to fall apart. And so in that, while you may have this moment in time to be getting away with murder, because that's very much what it seems like it is, given that there is no proof that this is anything other than that, other than, the word of somebody that you cannot take as trustworthy because they have consistently proven themselves incapable of telling the truth. Especially if in the case of them trying to protect their own ass. So in that situation, we can say that, this is an unjust situation, that somebody with the authority to be an enforcer of the law is one of their, highest duties of POTUS is to enforce the law. And by being the highest position of law enforcement in the land, their interpretation, their jurisprudence, their interpretation of the law and how they see it should be implemented really truly matters. And in this case, the POTUS believes in punitive punishment, execute now and don't ever ask questions, because it's much easier to not abide by the law because the law is, clunky and it's slow, and we want results now, sort of thing. But there's a reason why the law is clunky and it's slow, because sometimes it takes time for us to fully grasp the picture of what's going on, and we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. That's why the law is, you are innocent until you are proven guilty. And there's a reason for that, because of the fact that that's where the pivot point of legitimacy of law even comes into play. And, this is a POTUS that exploits the concept of law. He's a very, he loves to sue people, and I've had people in my life that I have, unfortunately at a moment in time, was tied to because they were, in-laws, and they too were very, they love to litigate, and they love to sue people. And what they looked at the court system as, which is what POTUS does, is looking at the court system as a tool by which they could force other people to be imposed by the law in such a way that would lead to a personal gain benefit for themselves. And the no regard for, moral legitimacy, no regard for, is it even reasonable, just, fair, or right? They saw the law as a tool to get what they want. And in that case, justice isn't served in a sense of that's something you probably could have worked out on your own without making it this big deal, and the POTUS very much sees that instead of working out his differences and understanding, not everybody's going to agree with him. And some people are going to, in one way or another, cause him grief because he brings it upon himself as being just a morally, inept person, a very nasty human being. And so he's going to have detractors. He's going to have dissenters. He's going to have critics. He's going to have people pushing back on him because we're trying to, in the, most effective terms possible, sanction him socially to say, you are a deplorable person and you should not be able to behave that way in society. That's not right. And he takes such personal offense to it because he has just a very fragile ego. And he turns his ego's worthless defense on people by making them defenseless in a situation where he has more money, power, control, and influence to, in the court system, beat out his opponents because they don't have the same type of resources as he does on those terms to defend themselves against his, use of the legal system as a tool to cause harm to the other side. Because on in his own standing, he doesn't have the capacity within himself to settle differences amongst other people in a reasonable manner. And because of that, he lacks the capacity of, the baseline standard of having civil society, which is, self-governance, self-control. And because of that, he is a lawless man. He breaks the law and there's no repercussions. And he sought to be, the highest law enforcer of the land and then to seek impunity for himself so that he can get in a position where he can do whatever he wants and nobody can stop him. And he already proved time and time again for his behaviors in court, that he had no intentions of ever following the law and that he will use the law, interpret it in his own sense of jurisprudence in such a way that makes sure that everybody else loses, even if the law applies, because ultimately he's the end-all be-all decision maker. And he knows, which is one of the fundamental problems of society in general, but mostly, most obvious in the justice system, is that it's those who have more money, more power, more influence, who those people are the ones that win out in the courts a significant amount of the time. Justice often does not prevail because there are attorneys that have, backroom conversations with judges and bypass the, legal process and system and already make their determinations before anything ever even goes to court. And then there are attorneys and lawyers that know how to game the system and rig the system and don't actually do their job in order to help make sure that the other side wins, and there's a very much, because there's a lot of money in that case, so many points of corruption in those systems. And so justice is not really just in society. And we are seeing that coming to a head now for years of not finding a way to fix for that problem, to make sure justice is actually truly just. The manifestation coming to a head is that we have a lawless leader in the role of president. And so there's another thing that Dr. King said in this letter from the Birmingham jail. He said that evading or defying the law leads to anarchy. And so we have a POTUS that is evading and defying the law. And what do you know? It's leading to anarchy. And not in a sense of where it's reached. We have civilization crumbling around us, and it's like the purge every single day, and people are not able to live out regular normal lives because we're all living in perpetual fear and everything's burning down. Where we're seeing is the precursors to something like that, for sure, but anarchy in the sense of very much what was experienced during the times of segregation, during the civil rights movement, where you had police officers, or what are supposed to be enforcers of the law, carrying out violence against certain types of people, and for there to be no consequences for the actions of those enforcers of the law because of this sense that there's no law to hold them back. And while there may be a law that exists and you can go and litigate it in court, that's a very slow process again. And that you may find a judge that is more favorable to upholding the ideological framework of allowing for these sorts of things to happen because of, trying to align with the president's vision for America, rather than saying, like, is this really on its own merits justifiable? And so you have many courts that are favoring continuation of this violent ferment that is happening in the form of first corrupting the enforcers of the law. That is one of the first stages of anarchy. And then when you see people watching, those who are supposed to be law enforcers getting away with violence, you are naturally shifting within the mentality of the individual a bitterness in regards to law, which then cultivates in their mind a sense that, law is lawless. And so now you are breaking down the natural moral uprightness of people who are self-governed. And you are leading them to question what is right in the world if so much unfairness happens. And if these people can get away with doing all these bad things in this regard, I know that I'm in the right in the sense of, like, I'm the immigrant who is just trying to make it in the world. I haven't hurt or harmed anybody. But because you have some title, and sense of entitlement to come in and cause harm against me and others like me in this, violent way of use of force, there's no reason for me to uphold, the sensibilities of civil order and abide by your laws and rules, because you're nullifying the existence of those laws and rules being even applicable. What's the point of following a law if the ultimate end result of that is nothing but more and more oppression and more violence that others get to do to you, but there's no course of correction for yourself? You're eroding the self-governance that prevents anarchy from going into total chaos. And that really, I think, is the most dangerous aspects of the POTUS 47's regime right now, is there are willfully and intentionally, and it was there throughout their campaign since Trump himself entered the political realm, an erosion of the self-governance within people. He role models this sense that there's no consequences for your actions, and that you don't have to govern yourself based off of these laws, because I'm going to show you how to get away with it, and I'm going to give you free reign to just be your worst self. And I'm going to compel you to bring that out because I'm going to be that myself, and you're going to want to be like me, because isn't it so appealing to want to be like somebody who does bad things and gets away with it? And who wants to bother with the burden of, the weights of conscience? You don't need to have one. Just get rid of that. You don't need to worry about considering others or having a conscience or, all those things. I was able to become a rich and powerful man by rejecting those things within myself. And then he's compelled so many people to bring the worst out in those people. And we've seen a degradation of civil society. We worked very, very hard during the civil rights movement to establish what is a civil society, man. We just don't do this type of stuff to each other. And it's not to say that we eradicated it completely, but we had in the social ontology, or the way that we live, this sensibility of self-governance that said, you're not, that's not the right thing to do. You're not allowed to do that. Come on, be smart about this, be reasonable, and then things that inspired people to bring out their best version. It's like, yeah, in that point of decision where you're left to your own devices and you're going to do based off of what, your internal sensibilities compel you to do, we're going to be the voice of reason in that moment to say, in this moment of discernment, this is what you should do. Even when it's the hard thing to do, to hold yourself back and refrain and self-control from taking out your aggressions against someone else who you see as getting away with doing harm to you, and where's the justice in the world? You refrain. Because what you're doing is you're giving that other person a moral example by which maybe not exactly in the moment, maybe also, yes, exactly in the moment, there is a shame that they bring upon themselves, and that you have become the example of that shame that they are going to have to now morally contend with. If they choose to do harm to you, that's their karma, not yours. And in the karmatic retribution of time, they are going to be led to a moment where they're going to have to face the consequences of that. And it may not be in direct connection to the harm that they caused you, but there will be a moment in time where things are going to come to a head. And in that moment of discernment, they are going to have to choose whether or not they're going to reconform, seek the path of redemption and reconciliation, and to, in ways, seek recompense, maybe not directly with you, but with the world at large, by devoting themselves to a cause for a better world, to say, wow, why was I left that way? Self-develop, self-reflect, and say, okay, now I understand, man, it was a long lesson and is a very painful lesson to have to learn, but I'm willing to do what it takes to continuously follow the path of, the way and the light to correction, so that I can return back into the body of moral legitimacy with my human family, And that's very much, I believe, the spirit that Dr. King really held when he was talking about, the civil rights movement. And as he's writing this letter to these faith leaders, from jail, he's like, I'm sitting here in the outcome consequences of my past and prior decision making. And while I may have broke the law, and law enforcement came and, confined me in this cell to, teach me a lesson, or to lead me to, face out the consequences of what happens when you break the law. But I sit here with a clear conscience, a clear mind, because I know that my actions of self-governance, my conscience is clear because I was doing the right thing. at the right time, the right way, for the right reasons. Because it's not just about me and my personal well-being here in the moment. It's also knowing that I am that example that should be and will eventually bring shame upon the individuals who have, sought to, afflict me. And they will come in due time to that personal revelation, and I have been called to serve in this way. And the cause is righteous. It's a noble cause. We are trying to make sure that we send a loud signal that this is not civil society. And we need to change that so it is more civil. Think of all the time, effort, energy wasted, breath wasted, human ingenuity and resource that was spent on, trying to force people to accept oppression. It's something I read in another one of my most favorite books is The Prince by Machiavelli. Again, more as the example of the counterpoint than it is of like the model of the right thing to do, but the counterpoint reflection. And in that particular book, it says that, one of the doggerel summits of one of the points in there is, it is much harder to, you must expend much more resources on control and force. And that is much easier to, govern a society if people just willingly submit to it. And it's true, look at all the resources that the POTUS 47 regime is expending in order to create enforcement of discrimination against immigrants. Billions of dollars have been, budgeted to help to police people that they can segregate based off of, discriminations and racisms, essentially. A fraction, I'm telling you, a fraction of what it costs to force these people out and to, insulate the oppressor from having to, face the consequences of the public uprising, saying that's not civil, this is not right, that are coming to protest this and to dissent and to protect their neighbors from this violence being done against them, which is unreasonable and not just. There's so much money that must be expended to force people into compliance with these racist policies than it would have been to just find a way to reasonably integrate those people who are here to, positively contribute and participate to society, integrate the immigrant, and then much easier at that point in time to weed out the unlikelies, the ones who are here with nefarious intent. And then with precision, accurate application, you can do a direct strike on those particular individuals. The bad hombres, the worst of the worst, the nefarious, bad actors with nefarious intent. You will be able to single them out and isolate them out because they're certainly not out there, panhandling mangoes out in the front of Home Depot, or selling tamales out of a cooler, on the side of the road, or selling bouquets of flowers, on street corners, or, giving, caregiving for elderly, the sick or disabled or children, or cleaning up houses or working in hotels and, working on farms. And, those aren't the bad hombres. They're not the bad actors with nefarious intent. They just want to live in peace. They want to live in a place with domestic order. They want to live in a place that has civil rights. They want to live in a place where, there isn't corruption in the justice system. They just want to live, and they want America to be a safe place. They're not here to make it worse. They're here to make it better, and they do. And for all of the people that are here to do bad things, once you are given a legitimacy pathway for immigrants to abide by and adhere to, you're singling out those who aren't here to do the right thing, because they're not going to comply with your reasonableness, because they themselves are not reasonable. And when you create a path of legitimacy for immigrants that's not oppressive, that's not mean, it's not violent, it's not terrorizing people and traumatizing people like POTUS 47's regime's entire playbook is, it doesn't do any of those things. And so people are willingly going to submit. They're going to come out from, their hiding places because they have no reason to hide. You don't have to hide the fact that you're an immigrant and that you may be here without, the papers that distinguish you as being, here, and we know you're here and you have permission to be here, and to build the legitimate pathway for people to seek that permission and legitimacy, which is what they would want to have, because they don't have any concerns, floating over their head, clouds floating over the head of concern of what's going to happen, if for some reason I'm found to not have this, permission slip to be here. And then not having to live in that sense, then they are within themselves naturally aligned with peaceful accord and are naturally likely to, self-govern in a way that is a part of social and civic ideals. And then they'll be able to positively contribute and participate to society without having to ever feel like they are put in a corner of desperation, or then left to their own devices, they could be forced to do potentially the wrong thing at the wrong time. And so the very small fraction of what's being used to force people, that small fraction of resources could have been used to integrate people. And we would have a much peaceful, situation. And we wouldn't have families being torn apart. We wouldn't have neighborhoods being decimated. We wouldn't have, companies be stripped of, good and decent workers. We wouldn't have huge hits to our economy. And we wouldn't have to be out and protesting in the streets to say, stop being racist, stop being violent to these people. Don't you have a conscience? Don't you have a heart? People who are working for ICE are being given $50,000 sign-on bonuses because it's the only way to compel people to go and do morally rotten things is to appeal to, the lowest common denominator, which is in a desperate economy, in a desperate world, and you got to find a way to make ends meet somehow. The one who's offering you cash dollars, sometimes you got to just do what you got to do. And so, society, domestic order, our economy, all these things are being crashed by the government itself. POTUS 47's policies are crashing the government to make it a more desperate situation so you can easily, give $50,000 sign-on bonuses and you can get people be willing to do all kinds of terrible things to each other. And that's exactly what's happening. It's not moral. It's not right. And another thing that Dr. King was saying in this letter from the Birmingham jail is the reason why they're doing it is that they're building up this sensibility in the minds of the oppressed and the oppressor, a sense of distinguishment and self-confidence and self-respect in the oppressed, to say that we deserve better than this and we demand nothing less than full integration into society and acceptance that we too are your fellow Americans. and there is no justification to do the harm that you cause against us. And then to also build up in the minds of the oppressor a sense of shame, build up a conscience in them to know this is wrong. It's wrong on so many levels, and you're going to have to deal with it in your own personal way, on your own personal day of revelation. Deal with the consequences of your actions, of your willing participation in this moral wrong. And Dr. King explained to us, these faith leaders, he's telling them, listen, guys, we could, not do what we're doing, which is not like we're out there, causing problems. We're just out there bringing to light that there is a problem, exactly what he said, bring it out in the open where it can be seen and be dealt with. Because unless it's seen, unless it's known, unless it's, understood, it cannot be dealt with. And so they were being this model example of the fact that there is an immoral cause of injustice happening in the world. And that there should be no institutionalized right to oppress individuals. And as King put it, we're not going to stop what we're doing, which is our moral urge to correct, set right things that are wrong, just because it might, in our quest for liberty and freedom and life and the pursuit of happiness, might precipitate violence coming from those people who want to reject those things for us because we're different, and the idea that the faith leaders were trying to, bring criticism to King to say, these things will work itself out in time. Just give it some time. You're being too impatient about this. You're demanding change way too fast, and the world just ain't ready for it, man. And that's causing a lot of problems. Don't you see that you're trying to push this too fast? And if you go too fast, then, things are going to start to break down, and then we have all this problem that we have to deal with. And it's like, if you just take it slow, eventually things will work out. And it's like, King says, no, time itself is neutral. And it can be used either destructively or constructively. And human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes from the tireless efforts of persistent work of men willing to be co-workers for and with good.